Welcome, Paul and David.
Good to be back.
Hi, Jacqueline.
I want to start with the most recent and pressing news about The Voice. The Liberal leadership met earlier this week and they decided to oppose the government's model for a voice to Parliament. Backbenchers will get a free vote on it, but shadow ministers are going to be bound by the party's decision. What was the reasoning behind the no stance, David?
There's a lot of concern inside the coalition party room about the scale of the Voice, about how far it reaches into the operations of Parliament and the government. And actually, it's been a long-standing concern. I mean, the idea was around when the coalition held government for 9 years. Malcolm Turnbull said we can't set up a third chamber of Parliament. The response to that was it's not a third chamber, it's a consultative body to advise Parliament. But even that is still deeply controversial within the coalition party room. And although a lot of people see it through the prism of Peter Dutton's leadership, the response to the Aston by-election and so forth, and he did call for this really rushed meeting on Wednesday. Nobody knew about it until Monday around lunchtime. So the process has been messy, but I think you can't forget that inside that coalition party room, they're deeply conservative on this point. They don't like changing the constitution to give an Indigenous organisation, The Voice, the right to consult with the executive government as well as the Parliament. And that's a huge stumbling block. And it's given Peter Dutton this, I think genuinely, this support in the room for him to come out with what he calls a resounding no. And that reflects not just his political calculations, but the will inside the room that they do not want that sort of power to be written into the Constitution and to be shared with Indigenous leaders.
Paul, is that your assessment of the situation as well? Is there anything you'd add?
No, I agree with David. And I think it's sometimes difficult for us in the media to tease out some of these very complicated constitutional questions that are front of mind for the MPs who are reading a lot of literature on this. They do, a lot of them, there's no doubt that there's politics involved in this decision. Anyone who suggests otherwise is lying. Every decision in politics is political. But there are really big fears among quite a big group in the coalition about creating this new centre of power in the middle of our government, effectively, that if it holds a position on, say, for example, grog bans in Alice Springs, which was a controversial topic a couple of months ago. Say, for example, The Voice came out and said, we absolutely oppose this is a racist law. We know the federal government was pushing for the NT government to reinstate those grog bans. Liberals fear a circumstance in which the government needs to go against this new, very culturally powerful body, and they worry about how a government would ever be able to go against their advice. We're creating this new unelected centre of power in the middle of our government, and that's something that really worries them.
Okay, so the within the party room at least, there's legitimately held fears about the operation of The Voice.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I think there's a huge debate about whether the fears are legitimate. Like, for instance, we've got former High Court judges, Justice Robert French, for instance, former Chief Justice, who says that this is workable, that this does not pose a significant constitutional threat or danger of judicial overreach after this is written into the Constitution. So that's heavily disputed. But I think inside that party room, they're not swayed by the former Chief Justice of the High Court. They're swayed by constitutional critics of this proposal on the conservative side of politics, and that's seriously driving them. And that highlights, in fact, why it's very difficult to change Peter Dutton's mind. I mean, he came out without any sign that he would be willing to compromise. It's just a hard no now at this point.
He kept using the phrase the Canberra voice to describe it. What do you think he was implying there, Paul?
I think this kind of carries echoes of the Republic referendum in 1999, which David would know a lot more about than me, where the opponents of Australia, cutting ties with the monarchy, tried to pitch the idea as an elitist idea that would give politicians more power in Canberra, but does nothing to help people on the ground. And that was an extremely effective line at the time. We saw support for the Republic go from majority support to a pretty convincing loss by the time that referendum was held. So this is Conservatives trying to pitch the voice as an idea that stems from elite Indigenous academics and politicians who are driven by kind of identity politics and not by practical benefit on the ground.
David, Dutton did put forth an alternative proposal on behalf of the Liberal Party. What did that look like?
It's actually a bit messy because during his press conference after the party room meeting, he sort of veered from total opposition to, well, here are things that we support instead. And I think...
Which we never legislated while we had the chance to do.
Yes, which they didn't do in the last 9 years. For instance, they support constitutional recognition for First Australians. That's something that John Howard supported in 2007. Then the coalition were in power for 9 years, Labor held power for 6 years, and there was disagreement about how to get it done. That has actually led to where we are today, but in theory, the coalition would support recognition.
Of a symbolic nature, just to clarify.
Yes, and so it would say we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of Australia, pretty much full stop. After that, there's no power that flows from it. They support legislating regional and local voices. That's bodies that would give Indigenous people consultation at a local and regional level. Now, here's an important point. Technically, the coalition supports a national voice. So for all Peter Dutton's rhetoric about how a Canberra voice is bad, my understanding of the coalition decision is that they support a national voice. It's one set up in legislation, not in the Constitution. There's a dispute about the power of this body.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're saying there cannot be a national voice. And so I think we're seeing an artificial argument to a certain extent because nowhere in Peter Dutton's rhetoric does he acknowledge the need for a national voice because he's now thundering against the Canberra voice. That's his catchphrase, that's his argument, and he's going to go full tilt on that. Forget about the details.
So what's the thinking there? I mean, because as you say, this idea of local or regional, lots and lots of local and regional voices is totally new. That's a bit of a red herring, it feels like. And they're just hoping that everyone will forget that officially Liberal Party policy is that they support a national voice, a so-called Canberra voice.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry to interrupt, Dave. Just further to your last point, another contradiction in the policy they put out yesterday is that Dutton is saying that at the end of this parliamentary inquiry into the current wording, which is really the point of contention, whether their voice is allowed to speak to executive government and ministers and bureaucrats, the fundamental sticking point. They say that they're willing to engage with the government on amending that wording for this referendum. So if they're willing to negotiate on the wording and make it more amenable for themselves, then they're leaving the door open to supporting a voice in the Constitution in this referendum as well, which again contradicts this Canberra voice argument.
Can I just add something? There's so much to talk about on that front. But the reason that point is so important is that a serious sticking point is the right of the Indigenous voice to make representations to executive government. Some people inside the Liberal Party just won't accept that. I don't think that's an area where the government will compromise. But if there is some different wording around that, in theory, there's actually scope for some agreement. It's just that we see the politics of Peter Dutton's response on Wednesday did not appear to brook any concept of compromise. But in theory, there is still a process to be run. There's a parliamentary committee that's set up to look at the wording of the referendum question. It doesn't report until, I think, May. So in that time frame, there could be further debate. There'll be public hearings about how to change the wording or offer a different wording that can satisfy some of these concerns about the power going too far. We haven't seen that play out yet.
It is, I mean, the Liberal Party's position, as you both have pointed out, does seem to be quite messy. But I suspect the average voter's impression is just the no, that they're not going to support it. And that's what people will take away from this morning's press conference. Some of the reactions have been pretty striking. I'm thinking particularly about Noel Pearson, who was a key architect of the Uluru Statement. He was on ABC Radio on Thursday. He said that Dutton's stance was a Judas betrayal of our country, and he called Dutton an undertaker preparing the grave to bury Uluru, by which he means the Uluru Statement. They were very powerful words. David, what did you make of that intervention?
I think that is a very powerful intervention, and that is in part because of Noel Pearson's stature as an Indigenous leader, but also the way he uses words. He is probably the best person I've seen deliver a speech. I remember a speech almost a decade ago where he said, we're on the cusp of Indigenous recognition. The planets are moving into alignment on this, and with a large enough lever, we can even nudge the stars. I mean, when he talks about reconciliation and recognition for Indigenous Australians, it's very powerful. But where we are today is a reminder that he thought we were almost there a decade ago. I think that does carry through into the debate. I think when Indigenous leaders repudiate Peter Dutton, I do think that weakens his position. He claims to have support from Indigenous leaders, but in reality, he's totally outnumbered on that. The weight of Indigenous support is certainly with the government, certainly behind the voice, in terms of the stature of those Indigenous leaders across Australia.
Yeah.
And I think Peter Dutton hasn't proven to Australian people that his way is a better way for the first Australians in this country. He is, however, sowing a lot of confusion that could give people a reason to say, look, I don't understand it, so I'm going to vote no.
Pearson, besides being very critical of Dutton, was very positive about the Australian people and said that, he believes in the Australian people. He believes this will be carried because they're making this decision, not politicians in Canberra. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese expressed his disappointment about the Liberal Party's decision, but he said something similar. He said this is our chance for a moment of unity within the nation. But Dutton interestingly said not only that they're going to formally oppose the voice, but they will actively campaign for the no vote. So that's quite an interesting decision. I just wonder what kind of resources the Liberal Party will throw at it, and won't, an active campaign be distracting for the Liberal Party leadership, particularly Dutton, when they have bigger fish to fry in terms of their own policy? Paul, why would they choose to do that?
It's a super interesting question. I think that was one element of yesterday's announcement that took people a little bit by surprise. I think it was unclear whether the party was going to come out and say, look, we don't support this as a party, we'll allow a conscience vote, but we're not going to be active participants in this. He answered a question from a journalist yesterday. Dutton answered a question which asked him whether he would actively campaign, and his words were, I will. He didn't give much detail on how that would look, so I think it's still a really open question. And it's unclear if he will be, if some of those issues we went through earlier about changes to the wording or potential compromise, or, there's a lot of water still to go under the bridge. But it's a fascinating question about whether he does actively campaign every day out there with the no side. I mean, if he does so, it means the stakes are much higher for him, and it really puts his leadership on the line if they lose. But I think there's still so much unknown about how he will campaign.
David, I'm just struggling to think of what the political dividend can be for Dutton if he was to actively campaign for a no vote, because he's associating himself with jettisoning or trying to wind back support for something which Australians overwhelmingly support, and at no political gain for his leadership, from what I can see.
Well, he did make that remark the other day about how his primary goal was to keep the party together.
Right.
And so I think the voice can be a unifying campaign for the Conservatives within his party room. They'll splinter, I think, on this over time, but I think he sees it as a way to crusade on something and go hard. I'm not saying that that's a wise course of action. I think that there are deeply held beliefs among the Conservatives, so they feel almost compelled to get out there and campaign against. I don't know whether that would mean Liberal Party resources going into it. But the reason I think that this is not necessarily wise is we just saw at the Aston by-election, huge swing to Labor, and the Liberal response was, well, isn't it strange? There are all these cost of living pressures and nobody's blaming Anthony Albanese. Well, guess what? Ever since the beginning of the year, Peter Dutton has been campaigning on the voice. He hasn't been going after the government hard enough on cost of living. And now they're surprised that they lose the Aston by-election. So, they're making their own political fortunes much more difficult with this course of action. And so I don't see it as being politically convenient so much as politically, I guess, a bit strange.
It seems like it would be an enormous distraction when there are legitimate areas where they could attack Labor very much firmly on Liberal Party ground, and that's around, cost of living and management of the economy. Paul, you covered Aston and you know a fair bit about what was happening on the ground there. Simon Birmingham wrote a piece for us, this week for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, saying that, the Liberal Party needed to shift perceptions and to align itself with people who rejected divisiveness and nastiness. He used those words not necessarily to describe his own party, but certainly that was the implication. Isn't this stance going to confirm perceptions among some that the Liberal brand is a bit nasty, Paul?
It may well, and that was a worry that was expressed by a number of MPs in their private party room meeting yesterday. Dutton told his backbench yesterday that, we won't appear to be siding with people who are uncaring about Indigenous people and potentially racist. We're coming out with our own proposal. This is not a hard no. We won't be accused of that. But several of his MPs, including Bridget Archer, Russell Broadbent and Richard Colbeck, said that there was a possibility that they would be lumped in with racists. So I think there is a level of kind of cognizance about that risk inside the party. Speaking of Aston, I wrote about a kind of a fascinating case study the day after the election when I was out in Bayswater, which is in the middle of that electorate. A 35-year-old tradie, kind of burly guy who, if you kind of looked at him, and I'm playing into stereotypes here, I acknowledge, you would think would at least be considering voting Liberal. And he had done so before in previous elections. But his words to me were that he just feels like the Liberal Party's out of touch and doesn't really resonate with him, that they don't talk about the issues he cares about. And his girlfriend was standing next to him outside a cafe nodding really strongly. So there is certainly a sense out there in the community that the Liberal Party's not in the middle anymore and not in the space where government is won and lost. And that comes through in both parties' research, and all politicians on both sides are aware of that, but it's about how to change it, I guess, which is a much more difficult question.
Just finally, David, you've talked about this being a possible moment of unity, I suppose, for the Liberal Party room, if not for the nation, to have this stance to oppose the voice. That's one political dividend that might pay off for Dutton. But from a sort of strategic and political point of view, what is in it for the Liberals to oppose something that polling shows most Australians want? So they're going to have to work really, really hard to whittle down that sort of natural, organic support.
Yes, and they could be spending their time on other campaigns. So Peter Dutton sees this as something that keeps Conservatives together. I don't think it keeps the entire Liberal Party together, because we already see Liberals coming out against Peter Dutton's position. The former Tasmanian Liberal Premier, the current Tasmanian Liberal Premier, the former Liberal Premier in New South Wales, Dom Perrottet, is in favour of the voice. So Peter Dutton already has divisions on the Liberal side, but in terms of the Conservatives in his party room, I think he's got them locked in.
But what about more broadly? I mean, I just don't understand what the play is from a strategic point of view when you've got to make up so much electoral ground to trying to be doing that by convincing people that they're wrong on something they naturally are inclined to support.
He thinks that the polling on the voice is soft, or the support for the voice is soft. Okay. And I think people who strongly want the voice to succeed, it worries me sometimes when I see them take the support for granted, because polling does show a majority of support for the voice in a majority of states. So the conditions are there for a successful referendum to make this change. However, support's relatively weak or not strong enough, okay, to be comfortable in WA, in Queensland. What are the swing states going to be? Well, there's an argument on the coalition side that there are going to be people in South Australia who don't like the voice. People who are more remote from Canberra won't like it. Maybe Tasmania will vote against it. I see a different dynamic. I see New South Wales being a swing state here. New South Wales is a state where there's support for the voice in majority terms right now, But it's a state that elects Mark Latham to the state parliament. It's a state that has support for one nation. There is possibly a scenario where majority support for the voice gets whittled down, eroded over time. In our polling, the Resolve Political Monitor, we see that support for the voice is now at a lower level than it was last year. On that trajectory, it gets very close to 50-50 if you're having a referendum by October. Peter Dutton believes the support is soft and that he can erode it. I'm not saying that will happen, but I'm saying that that is part of what's driving him here, that he thinks he's got a campaign worth fighting. I think the future for him, if the voice succeeds, is, it's a bit hard to say, the future.
It's really, there's so many variables, aren't there? I mean, he doesn't come out of it looking great, but then it's really hard to say.
Well, if the voice succeeds, the future for Peter Dutton is bleak to the point of political oblivion. And the reason for that is that a successful vote for the voice means Peter Dutton is at odds with the Australian people, has made a judgment that hasn't helped his own side of politics, and I think it would confirm that he's not really popular enough in the wider community to be a leader who can take the coalition back into power. And so I think a successful referendum on the voice is an outcome that leads to incredible trouble for Peter Dutton in his own political career.
Is the consequence for Albanese the potential end of his leadership, David, if he loses?
It's hard to sort of be precise about how it all plays out, but if the voice is defeated, that reflects on Anthony Albanese's judgment. However, Labor is quite unified on going for this change, and I think that means that they would have to reflect on a defeat, but not necessarily turn it into a immediate leadership question.
A blame game. It's such high stakes for everyone involved. It's kind of nerve-wracking, but also incredibly interesting and just such a fascinating period in our history, I think. I just want to segue really quickly to housing, because we also had a debate about that. And, that is something that's concerning people just on a very day-to-day cost of living basis at the moment. Liberals from across the country have formed a group to discuss policies aimed at transforming the housing market. And members of that informal group, including Peter Dutton and housing spokesman Michael Sakkal, have discussed changes to negative gearing and the capital gains discount. What do you make of this attempt to win back younger voters and those from migrant backgrounds and that kind of thing? Paul, I'll go to you.
Sorry, you guys just broke up a bit there. Have you got me?
Oh, yeah. I was just asking about, the Liberals' attempt to kind of they've formed this group about housing policy and they're discussing changes to negative gearing, etc. So they're sort of gearing up to make a pass at winning back young voters and people from migrant backgrounds with good housing policy.
I think this group is really interesting. It's very informal. It's very new, so I wouldn't read too much into their policy prescriptions yet. But what is interesting is that there's a new group of younger Liberal MPs, a couple in Victoria, Aaron Violi in the seat of Casey, which is quite near Aston, Keith Wallahan, who's a bit more close to the city in Menzies, and James Stephens in Adelaide. And there's some others around the country as well, and they're growing to the realisation that they need to do something really significant to make housing affordable again, because they know and research shows that people who own homes vote Liberal, and the increasing rate of renters and the very, very difficult scenario for young homeowners is pushing people to vote for parties like Labor and the Greens, because the coalition backs the interest of homeowners. There's some early informal conversations about whether the party should actually take on those two very contentious, difficult tax policies of negative gearing and capital gains tax. I don't think Michael Sakkal, who's the housing shadow minister, would be easily convinced on this. It would be a massive thing to do, because Bill Shorten's opposition lost an election largely on these policies in 2019.
Are they getting Bill Shorten in as a consultant?
Yeah. I don't think he has much time dealing with the NDIS, but
true.
something they are all focused on is housing supply, that there's unanimity on the point that needs to be fixed. But there are some really early conversations about whether the party should do something really brave and take on something like negative gearing or capital gains tax discount to differentiate from Labor. Now, I'm not suggesting it's likely, but there are some backbenchers who think that might be a way to really show themselves as being on the front foot on this topic.
That could get very interesting. Meanwhile, David, in Canberra, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's signature housing bill, which is a $10 billion housing future fund, was not passed in Parliament this week because the Greens objected to it, and they rejected it on the basis that it limits spending on social housing to only $500 million. What do you make of the dispute between the two parties, and will they come to an agreement? I mean, I know a lot of the Greens sort of supporter base are very much sort of young urban renters, so it's a very big thing for them.
Yes, and they think that they're on a winner with this push for a bigger housing policy. And to be honest, I think they are on a political winner. The reason we're seeing Simon Birmingham on the coalition side talk about housing, a need for a better housing policy, why we're seeing the Liberal MPs talk about this, why we're seeing the Greens go hard on housing, is because it matters so much in the community at the moment with the cost of living pressures and with rents going up. So all sides are trying to come up with something that they can take to the Australian people with a compelling proposition. The Greens are demanding more from Labor because the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund really sets up an investment. It takes $10 billion in debt, puts it into a fund, uses the earnings on that fund to then pay for some ongoing housing programs. But it's not $10 billion being poured into housing, it's $10 billion being put into stocks and bonds while the earnings are used. And so the Greens have this, I think, reasonable argument that it's not going to do enough given the scale of the housing problem that we've got in Australia at the moment. So it's really the scale that's the issue. Would the government try and cut a deal with the Greens by increasing that $10 billion, by doing more? I think that's where we're going to see the debate play out through to the May budget and beyond. There's no rush from the coalition. There's no rush from the Greens to cave in on this and agree to Labor's housing fund because they're out there campaigning, door knocking, and I think probably building up branch membership, saying we need a better policy on housing. We stand for rent control. We stand for more measures to bring down rents, and I think that's going to work for the Greens. Anthony Albanese believes he's got a good policy, so he's not in a rush to do a deal. Adam Bandt thinks he's got a great campaign. He's not in a rush to do a deal. And so at the moment, they're both out there with different messages.
It's interesting, isn't it? And meanwhile, while they're asked about this very, very difficult, almost intractable social problem, they can both point to what they're doing, even though what they're doing is kind of stalling. Thank you both very much, gentlemen. It's been such an interesting discussion. Paul, I think this is the first time we've had you on, and it's really nice to have you, and I hope you'll come back.
Really appreciate you having me. See you, David. See you, Jacqueline.
Cheers, Jackie.